What if you could easily create more value in your virtual reality simulation or game? This is John. He's an innovation manager, and John has been working with training systems and different learning methodologies for a long time now. And he calls himself an expert in knowledge transfer. John is also a tech geek and fancies new technology. His experience in knowledge transfer, affinity for technology, and being an innovation manager helps John to support his colleagues in solving training challenges they are facing every day on a regular basis. A while ago, John and his team were challenged once again. Some technicians of the maintenance department were confronted with a maintenance task they were not prepared for. The task they had to perform was never performed before due to the fact that the malfunction seldomly happens and that training for this in real life would involve a substantial safety risk for the technicians. Training and practice would simply put these technicians in danger and put the asset at risk. So John's team started working on a design for an interactive solution for the maintenance team to better prepare them for future tasks that are difficult to train in real life. Brainstorming about concepts, creating designs, setting up training needs, talking to technicians again, adjusting designs, having a group of specialized programmers and 3D developers build an interactive training product. And of course, this solution was built using the latest agile software development insights. It took a while for the version to get ready. Agile is not always as agile as it seems. Even with more discussions, changes, wishes, considerations to be taken, trade-offs to make. But finally, today, John and his team received the latest version of the virtual reality part-task trainer for the maintenance team and starts unpacking, installing and working with the maintenance team to get their final result from this incredible training device. Although the user experience in this interactive training is fantastic, the training content doesn't seem to be aligned anymore with the actual work procedures and training scenarios in real life. Due to common practice, work and safety procedures have been changed to match reality while John was developing the perfect solution for his colleagues. The time it required for the training needs analysis, the development, testing and deployment of this neat piece of technology simply took more than just the initial idea of using virtual reality technology for training. And since John required specialized software engineers to build it, every change he wants to make requires the same specialized knowledge to get it fixed and deployed again, which also takes time and additional money. Going back to the development team will result in additional cost, and no matter how good you prepare, you will face this challenge at all times since the world around you changes rapidly, which makes it difficult to anticipate to. So basically at this point, John has two choices to solve the issue of using high-end technology training solutions and overcoming the issue of ever-changing procedures and work instructions. The first one is simply pay for the change. Not very efficient, but if your budget is unlimited, it could be effective. Or, secondly, redesign your application to have scenario editing embedded into the interactive training. This can be an effective solution, but probably extremely costly and only tailored to this single training tool. Still, John will face additional cost and time to develop for changing content when the real-life training tasks ask for it. And while the world around John keeps on changing. But what if? What if John could easily change training scenarios in the interactive virtual training independent from specialized programming skills or the 3D model in the simulation itself? What if John could even add functionality to the interactive training, such as new scenarios, gamification, virtual instructions, and more? Even add training content that was not part of the initial training needs analysis. Wouldn't that be great? Before I go into detail on how John could achieve this, let me elaborate a little bit more on how we forget and how gamification can reduce this knowledge degradation. A 19th century German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, discovered the forgetting curve, explaining some of the fundamental factors that challenges us in learning and memorizing. The forgetting curve demonstrates that forgetting begins right after learning, with retention dropping steeply right away and then leveling off over time at nearly zero retention. By adding spaced retentions of learning, relearning repeatedly over time with intentional gaps between the sessions, the forgetting curve will start to look like this. The knowledge is retained better after each repetition. So you could say it sticks better when you repeat more often. Compare this to learning how to play an instrument. You can practice a specific song and master that, but that only makes you master the specific song. Rehearsing more and varying the music you play makes you master the musical instrument. Let's take a look at the 7 primary forgetting curve principles and how they are utilized by simulations and serious games. First, knowledge should be meaningful and relevant. If knowledge is relevant and meaningful, the knowledge is fully understood, and the trainee uses this knowledge to automatically make connections with the previously gained knowledge. This knowledge tends to stay longer in your mind than when these connections aren't made. Staying closer to reality in the virtual reality training tool will help the trainee easily to relate to real practice. Secondly, relevant tasks or challenges for the trainee to perform in a virtual world makes it easier to relate to the real-world tasks and challenges. And thirdly, the trainee can be challenged to make mistakes that would have serious consequences in real life. That fact triggers emotions to explore and learn from mistakes, which has a positive effect on knowledge retention. Let's test. Who has ever used a hammer for carpentry? Can you remember the first time you hit your finger while using it? You probably might. And me talking about this event might even recall the feeling that you had at that time. This is relevant and meaningful information. Secondly, training content should be inexhaustible. In traditional training, we tend to provide the trainee with information that is very structured and tells you what to do. In some cases, the content might vary a little bit per training session, but this is very limited in most cases. By using gamification techniques and adding game-based elements to your training, such as points, badges, and leaderboards, also known as PBL, the training content can vary a lot without losing track of the main training goal and knowledge to be transferred. So if John creates the ability to elaborate on existing training scenarios and create new ones over time, it will have a positive effect on knowledge retention for the trainee. Thirdly, facilitate easy relearning. Each repetition, relearning becomes faster and easier. We don't easily forget how to play and win a game we've played many times before, especially if it engages us and at an emotional level. Also, gamification allows us to repeatedly do instead of just think. Relearning is depending on accessibility of the training tool, and this again depends on the type of training tool. An interactive computer-based training, or even better, a tablet-based training, will be more accessible than a full mission training simulator that sits on a platform and relies on extensive control rooms. Don't get me wrong, full mission simulation and practical training will not disappear through computer-based training, but simply will get more effective. For this principle to work properly, it is of utmost importance to make accessibility as easy as possible for the trainee. This simply can be done by layering your solution. Just take a look at virtual reality training, but spread out the knowledge tool over a variety of platforms, starting with easy tablet or desktop training, growing to VR, and even using the training tool in real life using augmented reality to make retaining and on the job support as easy as possible. Every time using the exact same knowledge to be transferred. Fourth, more repetition increases the time it takes to forget. This fourth principle puts the third one really in motion. Most potential customers that contact me have the idea that training efficiency is about training less and therefore saving cost. This fourth principle underscores even more training. This can only be done using efficient training tools that are easy to access and allow endless training variety. John had already covered this using VR technology as his training system that is easier to access than training on the job. Fifth, space your learning in repetition. Who has ever studied to pass an exam and did this last minute? Probably started rehearsing the night before and perfectly passed the test. But what happened with that knowledge the day after? Taking more time to learn, practice, and rehearse, and also giving knowledge time to settle into your brain will have a positive effect on knowledge retention. Again, think of mastering a musical instrument. 6. Forgetting starts immediately after learning. You might have heard of the cone of learning by Dr. Edgar Dale. This cone describes the effectiveness in knowledge transfer of various transfer methods. For instance, reading a book will only make you remember 10% of what you actually have read. You might remember some important characters or objects such as a special car or certain dress a character worn, and maybe you will even remember the plot, but most of this information vanishes very quickly. At the other end of the spectrum, we have practice by doing, or even teach others. Then the knowledge retention can go up to 90%. But the closer to practice you get, the more difficult earlier mentioned principles persist. 7. When correctly done, forgetting slows down over time. As you can see in the graph on the screen, the combination of relevance, inexhaustibility, repetition, and spaces between repetition will slow down the forgetting. It simply takes time to master a subject or tasks. Well-designed simulations and serious games will be close to practice, since the main goal of using simulations and serious games is to overcome hurdles that cannot fully or partially be overcome in real life. They will relate to cost, access, and safety, but in the process of using them, they facilitate some of the mentioned rules. When using simulations and serious games for training, you might expect that access, retraining, meaningfulness, and inexhaustibility is taken care of already. But facilitating this takes more than the training tool itself. Using high-end technology requires IT skills to implement the tool into the organization, and it requires a different training approach for instructors and trainees. I don't want to scare you, but the implementation and deployment of a virtual reality training tool requires at least the same budget as the development of the tool itself. Getting back to John, we left him in despair with his VR training tool that lost relevance upon delivery, simply because development takes time and the world changes faster than he could keep up with developing it. Looking at the changes John faces, we might be able to distinguish two parts that can undergo major changes. The first one is the real-life asset that you need to work on or train on. And the second one is the procedure, related safety, manual, etc. As part of a virtual interactive training device, such as a virtual reality tool, the first one requires specialized knowledge for developing the asset in the virtual world. The second is the actual knowledge that relates to the physical asset, and therefore it also relates to the virtual representation of the asset. In other words, the first one is the subject to train on, and the second one is the training content itself. Which of these two elements you think would change more often over time? Maybe because there was a safety incident that required immediate action. In practice, we see that it's easier to change the procedure than the asset. Think of an aircraft our maintenance engineers were working on. Although in aerospace, changing procedures is extremely difficult, it still is less difficult than changing the asset itself. If you relate this to other industries, changing an asset is extremely difficult, but changing procedures is often the best and most efficient option. So for John, it's critical to make sure that the flexibility he requires to meet all real-life changes in the future of his training tool are not depending on the skills of specialized programmers, but stays within the team that actually owns the domain knowledge that relates to the asset. The initial trained maintenance team and the instructors providing the current practical training. Since they are not specialized programmers, an independent toolkit should be available to them that allows the team to easily create and alter training scenarios like they normally would do. To facilitate this in a virtual training, this flexibility should be implemented by design. Let me explain this. In the development process for virtual training, there are three main steps to be taken. The first one is optimizing the 3D virtual model of the asset. The original of this virtual asset can be any 3D created model using the latest modeling techniques. Secondly, the 3D model should be made interactive, so the trainee can actually interact with the 3D model. And thirdly, the scenario should be created so the training can start. When creating an asset in a virtual 3D world, the asset holds no interaction and is simply a hologram with no physical limitations whatsoever. To interact with this virtual asset, a specialized programmer has to add interaction to the object that the trainee needs to interact with. Please note that at this point, the programmer would relate the interaction to the scenario, which immediately limits the flexibility to that specific scenario, making reuse at least very difficult. By only adding interaction that matches the object, a hatch can only be opened, closed, and locked, will never become a wing or any other object. The interaction with this object is not limited to a specific scenario, but to the function of that object, which makes it match the real-life function even more, allowing unlimited use of this object in a number of scenarios. It even allows the instructional designer, who would be a non-programmer but having instructional skills, to create situations and scenarios that were never part of the initial training needs analysis without any programming skills. It would even allow the instructional designer to reuse parts of created scenarios on other virtual assets that have the same objects. Flexibility throughout. Creating this flexibility by design requires a platform-based approach where the virtual simulation is physically separated from the scenario editing tool. This physical separation also allows different graphical user interfaces for the specialized programmer using available development tools and the instructional designer focusing on structured scenario editing, allowing the instructional designer unlimited freedom and creativity for optimal knowledge transfer. All this information is stored in a central database, so reuse is even more optimized when using multiple assets with comparable procedures. It actually requires the virtual simulation to communicate with this platform database, to receive the latest scenarios changes without redeploying the simulation through the relevant IT channels, which limits the burden of the IT department and the trainee. And while having this active communication link available, why not track active trainee progress during all training sessions in the process? As you might understand, creating this level of flexibility requires implementation of this technique by design. It might be a challenge to re-engineer legacy training tools to adapt to this new approach, but often starting with missing elements in your training could be a perfect starting point in creating ultimate flexibility for your training need. New virtual and interactive training tools can be designed in a way the relevance for the trainee, but also the instructor and even the training organization raises exponentially, creating durable, maintainable, and flexible training tools that are cost efficient, effective, and adaptable to future training needs. Thank you.
So,
Hi.
hi. So, thank you for that talk. Super interesting. Since we didn't do an introduction before, I would like to know a little bit about your background, and if you could tell us a little bit about what you do and what your background is, that would be cool.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I can do that. Well, my name is Ruud Dullens. I'm from the Netherlands. Actually, I'm an entrepreneur already for more than 25 years, working in IT. My background is in computer electronics, basically the hardware side of it. And about 10 years ago, I started working with simulations based on a program we had in another company that I was running at that time. And this basically created the setup for what we are currently doing, which is basically creating flexibility within virtual training environments, because we've seen from big simulation environments that that a lot of stuff is being redeveloped and redeveloped and redeveloped every time. So basically, I'm the driving force behind that to make sure that within our organization we keep on track with that. And my other role basically within the company is that we work with commercial customers. So we are a business-to-business company. And basically every product that we create is based on a project and a customer question. And my role within the organization is translating and picking up these questions, and then basically coming up together with my team, of course, coming up with solutions that actually match, first of all, technology on one end, and implementing that in a workable solution that actually solves a knowledge issue within our customers.
And can you tell us a bit about the different areas? So in your talk, you mentioned aerospace was one, like where you have these training processes. What are other areas where a tool like this, where you train certain processes, are applied that you've worked on, and where this repetition and learning through that is key to perform tasks at hand?
Yeah, so first of all, of course, in training and in gaining knowledge, repetition is key. So people in general tend to learn from the fact that they do stuff a lot over and over again. If you only do it once, you'll forget it over time again, and that goes pretty fast. So repetition is basically applicable in any area that we could find. We as a company, we focus basically on bridging the gap between theory and practical learning. And practical learning, this, in most cases, big physical environment. You mentioned already aerospace, and I'll mention some others as well in a minute. You see that these big environments are hazardous and not easy to access. And by the way, if you want to train on it, let's say one of the areas that we are working in is healthcare. So if you want to train in an emergency room, then the issue that you face is safety for yourself, but also for the room, because if one of the things you use to learn is break things. If you break something, you can learn more because the fact that it broke. So by doing that in a real environment, it can become very hazardous for the environment and therefore very costly. Other environments that we work in is general industry, but also chemical industry. So we have a huge game basically already developed for the chemical industry, where people can train in a game-based learning way, can train safety awareness. And simply by doing and by facing hazards and trying to solve it. So it's basically sort of a quest that you have to do, and along the way you learn about these safety hazards. Another area is automotive, so the car industry, where we actually at some point even managed to get one of our games into the area where they use the game for certification. Which of course, training is one, but certifying, doing it through game, is of course a different level that we try to work on. So these are some of the areas. We do a lot more, but aerospace industry in general, basically everywhere where people work with their hands, that's the main area.
And what do you think is the hardest part to like? Is the customer already knowing that they want something to be training in virtual reality, or do you need to like show them an example that they realize what a great tool that could be? Or and then also, what is the biggest hurdle for the person actually doing the training? Like, is it then like top down, you're required to do it, or is it actually that they embrace it and then actually see the benefits that they're doing?
Yeah, we see a lot of variety there, because in some cases it's a mandatory training. So, for instance, we built a game for certifying car mechanics on electrical vehicles, so making electrical vehicles safe before they started to work on. This is one of the games that they use for certification as well. So that is mandatory. But sometimes it's used as what we call a pre-practice training. So you need to go to a practical workshop where you learn all the procedures of that company. But before you go into that workshop, you learn this environment basically through game. So you learn what you're going to face in this environment, which basically then raises the level of knowledge immediately in your physical workshop, because you'll recognize a lot of stuff that you already played with in the game. So it depends a little bit on what the customer need is. And well, basically this also is one of the I wouldn't say an issue, but it's one of the challenges we face in real life, and that is that because the world basically that we live in is pushing technology a lot, and this technology is in their face basically, and in some parts of the discussion they think that this technology solves their problem. But if you then drill down and ask more questions, and that's some of the things that we do very good, is really drill down to their real knowledge gap, basically, that you need to bridge at some point. And so by doing that, then you'll see that maybe the technology that they're looking at, so I want to do something with VR, is maybe not a solution for them, because they might have 20,000 people to train, which might be a challenge in VR. So then we might choose a more, just as I said in my presentation as well, a sort of a layered approach, where we start rolling out to a large group of trainees, and then when you progress during your training, it gets more specific, and you need VR, XR, AR, whatever technology. So we, in general, we mix the technology where it's applicable, and not especially just because the customer wants it. Sometimes we actually try to get them off technology because it simply doesn't solve their knowledge gap, basically.
And so I suppose through asking all these questions, you become an expert in actually the process that they are requiring, right? So you now understand lots of these car manufacturing and aerospace, and knowing what they actually do, because you build these applications or these processes. And then I also wonder, because in your talk you mentioned that that the person actually doing the thing, or that then has that process, that they should be able to also adjust and change things. And how is that? Because I mean, you're asking all these questions to figure out exactly the process, but then how do you develop the things that might change, or that they might need to adapt or be able to change themselves? Like, how does that work? That's super, like, you have to think ahead, right?
Yeah, well, that's why in my talk I mentioned the fact that you need to do this by design. So it needs to be in there to have this facility. And also what we do is we basically split the specialized programming knowledge from the knowledge about the asset. So our customer holds all the knowledge about the asset that we are building a training for. And we hold all the knowledge to actually develop it for them. So what we do is we basically form a team, and we have this platform which is called Virtual Studio, that is an open platform that basically can connect to a game. And if you did it by design, then actually these two are going to talk to each other, which is then basically an integration that does, first of all, basically brings you the scenarios, but gives the customer or the owner of the training, gives them the ability to change the scenarios, just like you would do in a content management system. So you can change procedures, you can even create new scenarios that you even didn't think of during the development, because the development is not based on interaction based on scenarios, but is basically based on interaction that matches the virtual world. So like a door simply holds the functionality of a door. It can be opened and it can be closed. So we use this platform to actually give a customer the ability to change the virtual environment, not the way it looks, but the way you work with it, unlimited, basically. So that's one end of the things that we are doing there. And then basically by doing that, we don't need all the specific knowledge of this customer. So it's nice to have all the knowledge, but in most cases, the customer only thinks in the procedure that you should do. But if you look at game-based learning, I want to have procedures where I can do things that I shouldn't do, and then get sent back to the real path that you should learn, basically. So game-based learning, of course, well, a lot of people in this event are, of course, aware of games and stuff like that. And it's all about exploring. And that is something that we basically built in. And so most of our questions that we ask the customer are actually based on what can go wrong instead of what should you do. Because what should you do is normally on paper. We can simply get it. It's a procedure, it's a manual, it's something that is there, but it doesn't describe what you shouldn't do. And that's what makes it interesting. And what we see is having this platform for the customer ready to work with and to change and alter scenarios, is that they alter these scenarios based on what you shouldn't do. So, and then giving you feedback on, well, you did this, that's not a good thing, maybe you should try something else. And then you get more a game-based approach, basically.
What would be one, like if you could choose any kind of scenario, like what would be something that you would really like to work on, like not for maybe a company, but really like, okay, I want to really figure out how a process or what people can do wrong in a certain way. Is there anything that you would say, like, if I ever get the time to, and maybe the funding, that you would like to work and explore? Like, is there anything out there?
Yeah, well, I can think of a lot of things that that would actually match this. In most cases, it's because the customer has a challenge. But one of the cool things that we're currently working on is that we are able to build scenarios based on your competences. So where originally as a company, we come from a very structured way of running a scenario. So you have to start up this machine, then you have to do this, and that. But looking at more an approach where people are being valued based on their previous competences that they already have, is that you can actually skip steps or maybe do things in a different way because you are allowed based on your competences. And we are currently actually doing some cool stuff on this end to make scenarios even more flexible for customers, but also make it easier for we call it an instructional designer that actually builds your scenario, builds your instruction, either from our side as a company or a delivery company, or on the other end, our customer, to actually make it easier to create a variety in the scenarios. And basically, so it's not a single scenario that I would say is special to work on, but it's basically the flow in a scenario that can be automated using artificial intelligence and stuff like that, that makes it interesting to work on and to build something like this. Super interesting. It's totally a new field for me to even learn about how you approach this. How would people be able to get in touch? Maybe, like, I don't know, are you in the Discord server of Global XR Bootcamp? Yeah, can they reach out? I'm actually in the Discord server currently, so they can find me on my name. That's no problem. And of course, I'm not sure where my company name normally would be in this session, but they can find me through bluetooth.nl as well. And yeah, we are a Dutch-based company, basically a fairly small company, but a fairly innovative company that works with large customers. So we did some very nice projects already over time, where we work with some major organizations that are globally present, basically. And do you see a difference there depending on, like, cultural context? Is there a different way of learning all over the world? Is that something that you realized that you can give us an insight on? Yeah, that's always difficult. We rely a lot on the company's knowledge there because they work with these people, of course. But in most cases, it's not simply translating your application. Although we have the technical ability to do that, it's also taking care of some elements. So once we did, this is a nice anecdote, I think. Once we did a game for a company that works in the entertainment industry, so like amusement parks, and they do what they call dark rides, which is basically you're in a little cart and then you can shoot on targets and stuff like that. And it's basically a dark room and you see these big screens. And once we had to translate a game which was called Beach Fun, and it was basically created for the European market, and they wanted to use it in the Saudi area, so in the Middle East area. And then suddenly you get faced with the fact that all your avatars are basically in bathing suits that do not match the culture there, which actually required us to dress them again, which of course in the virtual world is not that difficult, but still it takes. But this is something that we normally don't take care of. That is really something that our customer needs to tell us to do. But also in the scenarios in Word or stuff like that, it's something, and that's why we have this platform, Virtual Studio, because if you look at development, and maybe some people in this stream are actually developers, that in our case, 8 out of 10, or maybe even 9 out of 10 changes during the development, we don't have to make through a developer, which also limits us that we don't have to do rebuilding of the application, sending it again to the customer, they have to deploy it again. So the complete deployment process basically goes away, because doing it through the CMS, through Virtual Studio basically, is an instant thing. So everyone that has the application already and logs on again simply gets the change in the scenario, which makes it more flexible basically.
Yeah, and that's what you developed inside the application. So you made it that flexible before actually putting content in there, right? So
yeah, it's actually an independent platform. So basically the application talks to a sort of a database, which then brings me to another point, if I may bring it up. Which is basically, if you have a training application, then basically it's not only about the player that plays a game and gains knowledge, but it's also measuring what the player actually did and how this player gained the knowledge. So game-based learning is more about how did you get your knowledge, instead of can I tick all these boxes in a questionnaire that you actually know what you learned. Because basically doing a test at the end is very very thin. Because if the questionnaire or the test is not created in the correct way, you'll see that it's easy for someone that didn't do any theory could actually fill out this test perfectly, because question and answer is a kind of logical combination together. Where in a game-based way, we actually track simply what the user is doing. And based on that, we value if the user understands what he's doing, compared to simply at the end testing. So we also gather this data so that a customer also knows what the level of knowledge transfer basically is in the application. And that is a separate entity basically. It's a separate application that we can put more games in. So a customer could have more games running in the same instance of this database. And the next step for us, I'm not sure if you were going to ask this question actually, but the next step for us is going to be streaming gaming in the B2B market. So there are large platforms already out there, but they are mainly focused on B2C. So large game studios that build commercial games. But for the business-to-business market, there is not that much access that you can get to these platforms. So we are currently working on a methodology of our own to actually build a streaming gaming platform, which I hope we will somewhere finalize in the first half year of next year, and get available in the market. So we are also constantly trying to make it easier for the customer to deploy their application.
Cool. So that sounds super interesting. I'll keep an eye on that, and I think also our viewers. And I think with that, I would like to thank you again for this very insightful talk, and see you on the Discord server.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll be there. I'll have my messages and notifications on, so if people want to reach me, then they can find me there.
Okay.
No problem at all. Thank you, Mon.
You're welcome.
All right.